Okay. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. And tonight's our special speaker is Professor Keristofer Clohessy, who is a Roman Catholic priest and professor of Shi'i Islamic studies at the Pontifical Institute for Arabic and Islamic Studies, or PISAI, in Rome, Italy. He is the author of Angels, Hastening, the Karbala Dreams in 2021, Half of My Heart, The Narratives of Zaynab, Daughter of Ali, published in 2018, and Fatima, Daughter of Muhammad, published in 2017. In this talk, he will talk about his forthcoming book about Abul Fazl al-Abbas. And as you remember, we had the honor to be his host for last year, and this is the second year we are hosting him. And tonight, we are looking for his tonight's talk about Abul Fazl al-Abbas. Please, Professor.
Thank you. So let's focus in now for a few moments on this extraordinary personality of Al-Abbas, son of Ali, without doubt. And you know this better than I do. Among Shi'i devotees, he has an incalculable popularity. And that popularity is in no way negated by the fact that there are really very few academic texts about Al-Abbas. There are plenty of books written about him, but very few primary sources among the early and then later Shi'i and even Sunni sources. Now, that absence of sources means that when we try to construct a life, a biography of Al-Abbas, it is necessarily going to be a life in fragments, where we tell bits of his story, the bits that we know well, and we add pious tradition to those bits that we know well. Many of the gaps of Al-Abbas's life, his life before Karbala, for example, his younger years when he lived first with his father Ali, then with his half-brother Al-Hassan, and then the last years of his life, which he lived with Al-Hussein, very few details are known about his actual biography in those years. We know, of course, that he grew up in the holy shadow, if you like, of the Ahl Bayt of his father and his two brothers. But aside from that, we know few details. The most important moments of Al-Abbas's life are around really his very heroic actions and his heroic death, of course, that have been told over and over again in what you might call the liturgical settings of Shia Islam. That is the Taziyah and the Majalis settings. And within those settings, the figure of Al-Abbas is an iconic figure. He is almost an archetype for people of what courage and selflessness really is. And so, like many of the members of the Ahl Bayt who were gathered around Al-Hussein and around his martyrdom, I think that Al-Abbas's story needs to be told wider, to a wider audience, perhaps to an audience that isn't just part of the Shia or even Islamic family, maybe not just part of the Christian family, but to a much wider audience than that. I would say that Al-Hussein and his half-brother Al-Abbas live in what you could call a virtuous circle. They nurture each other. They fuel each other's energy and each other's story. Al-Abbas is Al-Hussein's champion. He's his bodyguard. He's his standard bearer, his diplomat, he's his negotiator. And he is entrusted in the period of the Karbala battle itself and the days before the battle with more than one very dangerous mission. When Al-Hussein, in some of the narratives, learns that Al-Abbas has been killed towards the end of the battle, he cries out, "My back is now broken, and I lose hope in everything now that Al-Abbas is gone." It's a lament that is carried by very few of the earlier transmitters, but it's a lament that has found its way into the piety around the life of Al-Abbas, not only to show his closeness to Al-Hussein, not only to show how much Al-Hussein relied upon him, but also perhaps to show that, in a sense, he is the backbone, Al-Abbas. He is the backbone of his brother's imamah. For his part, Al-Abbas unlike al-Hussein, is a hidden figure. He almost hides behind al-Hussein. There is a sense that al-Abbas never wants to draw attention to himself. He's a man of very few words. He is the first to speak when he has to. But aside from that, he is wordlessly valiant on the field of Karbala. About 70 or so companions stood shoulder to shoulder with al-Hussein at the Battle of Karbala. All of them died defending him. About 20 of those approximately were actual members of his people, the people of his house. But of all of those 70 people, including those that actually belonged to his house, al-Abbas receives far more attention in the sources. And more than any other person with al-Hussein, his character and his personality, which are shaped by the actions, especially on the day of Karbala, are shaped and formed also by the later readings of his life, the ritual enactments of his life that take place year by year in so many religious or liturgical settings. He's the diplomat, he is the negotiator, the banner carrier, the one who goes looking for water. He is, in a world of selfishness, the archetype of what it means to be absolutely selfless. He is the last man standing. And he becomes the icon, really, of unwavering family support for al-Hussein. And he becomes the anti-model for every single person who betrayed the cause for which al-Hussein stood. The story of al-Abbas, probably known to most people, the parameters of the story are actually quite uncomplicated. He is, together with three blood brothers, a son of Ali bin Abi Talib, not by Ali's first wife, the lady Fatima, daughter of the Prophet, but by a much later wife who arrives on the scene after the death of Lady Fatima, but whose name is also Fatima, and she herself, known now as al-Banin, she would win her devotion and fame in her own right. The early life of al-Abbas, like so many of the characters of that particular era of Arab Islamic history, is very badly recorded. We have very few details. He is said by some to have fought at the Battle of Siffin. But even if you really juggle the dates as hard as you can, it is very difficult to understand his presence there. He would have been aged 11 or 12 at the Battle of Siffin, and there are at least two texts in which Ali forbids him to fight as he forbids others to fight. And therefore, the idea of a combative role for a very young al-Abbas at the Battle of Siffin is a textual and a historical problem that we need to examine a little more carefully. He may have been confused, of course, with a fighter by the same name. Nonetheless, there are texts or there are pious traditions that insist that al-Abbas was present as an 11-year-old and might even have exchanged places with his father, clothing and horse, in order to confuse the enemy. It is historically and academically, it is a real problem to try to work out what his position at Siffin was. He's a child of Ali, but not of Lady Fatima, and therefore he doesn't share with his two brothers, Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein, in the imamah, in the imamate, and in all of the supernatural gifts that belong to the imamate. But he gives his life defending it, defending Al-Hussein, the man who represents for him everything that is holy about that institution. So the way that I try to tackle al-Abbas in the book that I'm attempting to write about him is to begin with a middle point. So you have, as we will see in a moment, the very early transmitters, a mixture of Shi'i and Sunni historians, and then you have the much later transmitters who tell quite a different story about al-Abbas on the day of Karbala. And I've tried to find, as a starting point, a middle point. So I've taken the work Kitab al-Irshad by al-Mufid, Sheikh al-Mufid, because Sheikh al-Mufid in his al-Irshad gives us 7 particular details about al-Abbas on the day of Karbala. And so those 7 details, as a starting point, give us a chronology for the circumstances that finally led to his death, whenever his death was, because there are some texts that suspect he may have died already on the 9th of Muharram while trying to get water, although that seems to me very unlikely. But al-Mufid's chronicle of events lacks the details of the much earlier chronicles. And by the much earlier chronicles, I'm thinking of Abu Mikhnaf, of course, and those who transmit from him. And the sequence of events that al-Mufid gives for al-Abbas on the day of the battle is very different from some of the other Maqatil works. The reality is that al-Mufid leaves out details which puzzle me, details which I would have imagined he would have put in. And he also puts into his Kitab al-Irshad a change in some of the emphasis and the timing. So he doesn't give us a very extensive framework in order to construct a life of al-Abbas, but his account is of great interest to us. He is a prolific and a highly reputable Shia jurist and theologian, is al-Mufid. And yet many of the details that we read about today and speak about today in terms of al-Abbas on the field of Karbala, those details that are recited in so many places as part of the Majalis tradition, are inexplicably absent from the writings of Mufid and differ from some of the earlier writings. So let's look quickly at these 7 moments in the life of al-Abbas, talking more about some and less about others. The first moment that al-Mufid thinks important is this offer of indemnity that al-Abbas receives. In fact, it's not an offer of indemnity, it is a double offer of indemnity. The first one comes from Ibn Ziyad, and it comes at the urging of a man called Ibn Abi Muhil, who happens to be in Ibn Ziyad's court, but is also related to al-Banin, mother of al-Abbas. And he persuades Ibn Ziyad to write a letter of indemnity for al-Abbas and for his 4 brothers, Jafar, Abdullah, and his 3 brothers, Jafar, Abdullah, and Uthman, but quite patently not for another brother, not for al-Hussein, who is carefully removed from any possibility of indemnity. So the letter comes and is read by al-Abbas and his brothers, and in some texts, all the brothers together. In other texts, al-Abbas as their spokesman, as the eldest of the 4, absolutely rejects any possibility of such an indemnity, which does not include the name of al-Hussein. But that's not the end of the story, because either just before or just after the letter arrives, depending on who you're reading, Shimr, the tremendously evil soldier and leader of the forces at Karbala, who also happens, regretfully, to be a relative of al-Banin, goes and stands in front of the tents of al-Hussein and his companions and summons forth the 4 brothers, that is al-Abbas, Jafar, Abdullah, and Uthman, and tells them, you're free to go. I'm giving you safe passage off the field of Karbala. And of course, al-Abbas, speaking on behalf of the brothers, or maybe all 4 brothers together, absolutely reject him. There's a great deal more about those 2, but we don't have time to go completely into all of the details. On the same night, second point of al-Mufid, on the same night, al-Hussein instructs al-Abbas to ride out and meet the enemy, who are now making quite a lot of noise as they get closer and closer, and to find out what has changed, what the situation is. The idea that they seem to have wavered and hesitated, but now something has changed and the enemy are beginning to move forward. This riding out as diplomat and negotiator, this for me marks the first of the 3 major roles that are given to al-Abbas on the field of Karbala, which we will see one by one. He is accompanied in this negotiation by approximately 20 horsemen. That's quite a large proportion of al-Hussein's very small army. And he is offered by the enemy, having approached them to ask what the situation is, he is offered a choice. Either al-Hussein must submit to Yazid bin Muawiyah, or they will be attacked and defeated militarily. Al-Abbas, the negotiator and quite clearly skilled diplomat, persuades them not to do anything until he has returned to Al-Hussein and informed him of the situation. So Al-Abbas goes back to Al-Hussein. This is probably sometime in the late afternoon, early evening of the 9th of Muharram. He goes back to Al-Hussein to tell him what the enemy is saying. And Al-Hussein then instructs Al-Abbas to go back a second time and to delay the enemy for a night and to give the excuse that Al-Hussein and his companions want to spend the night in prayer and in reciting Quran. Al-Abbas goes back, but in almost all the texts, he does not mention Quran and he does not mention the recitation of prayer. Instead, he tells the enemy army that Al-Hussein wants time to think over the proposal. Academically, it is a very puzzling point because it seems as though at that moment, Al-Abbas has taken matters into his own hands. Now, there is a strong possibility that being the skilled diplomat, he understands that the request for time to pray and to recite Quran might not be well received by this particular enemy, whereas a request to ponder matters might be a better chance. Whatever the situation is, there are only two of the earlier sources in which Al-Abbas reports exactly what Al-Hussein has said. In almost all the others, he changes the motivation for this delay overnight, and the delay is given. What is clear is that Al-Abbas is proven in these incidents as a diplomat and a negotiator who has an excellent skill. There's no doubt about this. Thirdly, says Mufid, still on the 9th of Muharram, still on the night of the 9th, Al-Hussein attempts to dispense his followers from any oaths and vows they have and invites them to use the night the way a person would use a camel. Use the night, the darkness of the night, to carry you away. In almost all of the texts, but not all of them, Al-Abbas is the first one to reject this proposal and to suggest that they would never think of doing such a thing. There are some texts, including some Shi'i texts, in which it is not Abbas who speaks first, but someone else. But for the most part, Al-Abbas takes the lead in representing, if not the companions, all of them, then at least the members of the Ahl Bayt, the people of the family. So we're now coming to the end of the 9th of Muharram and to the early morning of the 10th of Muharram. And that early morning is the fourth chronological moment that is offered by Al-Mufid. On the morning of Friday, the 10th of Muharram, there's some dispute, but by my reckoning, most of the texts agree that the Battle of Karbala was on a Friday. Ashura was on a Friday, not on a Saturday. On the Friday, the 10th of Muharram, Al-Hussein mobilizes his forces and he gives his standard to Al-Abbas. It's a curious thing that the enemy army, the standard is given to an unknown man of no importance who is only ever once heard of again, and that is when Shumr or Umar bin Sa'ad summons them to battle. But Al-Hussein understands the role of the flag bearer, the banner bearer. And so after the diplomatic negotiations that Al-Abbas has been invited to do, this becomes his second most important and most major role on the Battle of Karbala. Now, at this point, there are two other incidents that for some reason Al-Mufid decides not to put into his text. Briefly, the first is that after Al-Hussein's address, what you could call his last khutbah, not only to the enemy, but also to his own family, the women of his camp become quite grief-stricken. And he sends Al-Abbas and his son Ali to comfort the woman. That incident is found in many transmitters, but it's not curiously found in Al-Mufid. And the second small incident is that after the battle is begun, Al-Abbas single-handedly goes to the rescue of 4 of Al-Hussein's soldiers who have advanced too quickly, and they become surrounded by enemy soldiers and are severely wounded. And Al-Abbas by himself goes and rescues them and tries to bring them back. In some texts, they refuse to come. They say, no, we're going to stay here and fight. In other texts, he brings them back, but all four of them die later in the battle. Okay, so we move to the fifth chronological point, and it's in Mufid, it's after battle has been engaged, and Mufid now returns to the figure of Al-Abbas. And he puts this incident immediately after the death, the dreadful death of Al-Hussein's youngest son, Abdullah, as he sits on his father's lap or lies in his father's arms. Abbas, looking around and seeing how many have now been killed, invites his three blood brothers, Jafar, Abdullah, and Uthman, to go ahead into battle, to go in front of him into battle, because all three of them are childless. And so he says to them, go forward and I will be your heir, and then I myself will go forward. And so these three sons of al-Banin, each of whom deserves his own biography, they go forward individually reciting powerful poetry, laments and poetry, and each of them is martyred. Even in the earliest accounts, these three martyrdoms, the three sons of al-Banin, are seemingly the last before Al-Abbas and Al-Hussein, so that it seems at this point, after the death of his three blood brothers, that Al-Abbas and Al-Hussein are the last two men standing. This is the moment, point number 6, where Al-Mufid becomes a little hazy and difficult to understand, and far less detailed than the other historians. And it is really in the most important task entrusted to Al-Abbas, the task for which he is named As-Saqa, the water carrier or the water bearer. According to Mufid's account, but not the early transmitters, according to Al-Mufid's account, at this moment, when there are just possibly two of them left, besides, of course, the women and the children in the tents, Al-Hussein's thirst becomes so severe that he attempts to get to the nearest water source, either the Euphrates itself or possibly some kind of dam or some tributary like the Al-Qami, but a source of water. Moving in front of him is his brother Al-Abbas, who has just lost his own three blood brothers. But of course, their access to water has been blocked, and it's been blocked for a number of days already. And so the horsemen of Umar bin Sa'ad block the two of them, and Al-Abbas finds himself surrounded by the enemy and deliberately separated from Al-Hussein. And although he fights valiantly, he is easily outnumbered and he is killed. And a number of texts name a variety of soldiers who are regarded as the ones who killed him. Now, there's a whole lot more to this story, but what interests me is that the attempt by Al-Abbas to source water and bring it back either to Al-Hussein and his soldier companions, or to Al-Hussein and the women and children in the tents, this story is told very, very differently by the much earlier Shi'i and Sunni transmitters. Now, in essence, there are five, let us say, 5 maqatil, 5 works written between the 2nd century of Hijrah and the 4th century, so the 8th, 10th century, that are trusted as authentic accounts of the Battle of Karbala and the death of Al-Hussein. The first, of course, is Abu Mikhnaf, who seemingly was a Shia, but we don't have his text anymore. It's long gone. It exists now in a number of recensions made by other scholars. But he is the basis for our knowledge about details of the battle, eyewitness accounts of the battle. Secondly, there is Ibn Sa'd, the Sunni, in his famous Kitab al-Tabaqat, in which he has a maqtal of Al-Hussein, excuse me, which he has taken from some of those who have used Abu Mikhnaf. In his case, he translates from a man called Al-Waqidi, and Al-Waqidi's text no longer exists, but Al-Waqidi had a recension of Abu Mikhnaf. Thirdly, we have the famous Sunni historian Baladhuri, and Al-Baladhuri also has a maqtal of Hussein in his book, Kitab Ansab al-Ashraf. And he also has taken from recensions, that is, other people who've taken from Abu Mikhnaf. Fourthly, the Sunni ad-Dinawari. Dinawari has this book, Kitab al-Akhbar, Tiwal, the book of big reports, long reports maybe. And he also is a Sunni, and he also uses people who used Abu Mikhnaf. And finally, we have a Shia, Ibn A'tham, his famous book, Al-Futuh, The Conquest. So these 5 books generally are regarded as the most authentic reproductions of the work of Abu Mikhnaf, whose text no longer exists. Sadly, although there are some fake texts around that are attributed to him, but his actual text no longer exists except in little fragments. And in terms of how Al-Abbas went to get water in these 5 maqatil, they're very different from Ishar. So there are 5 possibilities. In the first place, there is a theory that at some stage, on the days preceding the battle, Al-Abbas went together with a group, quite a big group, maybe up to 50 horsemen and foot soldiers, all of them carrying water flasks or water skins, went to get water for Al-Hussein. And there was a bit of a conflict on the edges of the Euphrates, or maybe on the edges of wherever they were fetching water from, the dam or the tributary. But that Al-Abbas and his up to 50 companions brought back water successfully to Al-Hussein on the 9th of Muharram, perhaps, or maybe the 8th, or maybe even the 7th. You must imagine that if the water had been cut off definitively, certainly by the 7th at the latest, the thirst must have been intense. And I can't imagine that there was no attempt to get water before, a few moments before Al-Hussein's death. There is the possibility, of course, that there were numerous attempts to go and get water, but this is the attempt that is most carefully narrated by these earliest. So Abu Mikhnaf, Baladri, Ibn Abi al-Dunya, ad-Dinawari, at-Tabari, Khwarizmi, Ibn al-Athir. These are all people who tell this first theory, and it's the most well-established theory. There may have been an attempt by Al-Abbas on the day of the battle to get water, but this is the attempt for which he is named. There is a second theory, found in very, very few texts. It suggests that Al-Abbas was killed just before Al-Hussein at Karbala, but it mentions nothing about water. Ibn Abi ad-Dunya, for example, has this story mentioning the death, but he doesn't mention, as Al-Mufid does, the fact that they were killed trying to get water at the end of the battle. Then there's a third proposal. And the third proposal fascinates me because it comes, first of all, from Al-Qadi al-Nu'man, who was an Ismaili scholar, 4th, 10th century. And it is found also in Sheikh Mufid, and that is that Al-Abbas was killed just before Al-Hussein, as together they attempted to reach a source of water. So that is Al-Mufid's theory. And it is not he who proposes it. It's found earlier than Al-Mufid. It's also found in Ibn Ta'us. So it's an interesting theory, but it doesn't make any mention of an attempt the day before to fetch water with all the events that surrounded it. Because the day before, that first theory, while they went to get water, there was certainly a fight, but they brought back what I would imagine is a substantial amount. It's curious that this is missing from some of the texts. There is a fourth narrative that you're going to find in people like Ibn Shahrashu. And this is the narrative that is most recited in the Majalis settings, because in this narrative, Al-Abbas, without Al-Hussein, attempts on the day of Karbala itself, during the battle, perhaps towards the end, to attempt to get water for Al-Hussein, and if not for his companions, then at least for the women and the children. Now, curiously, the 4th, 10th century Ismaili, Al-Qadi al-Nu'man, he also recounts this possibility. So Al-Abbas fights his way furiously through the enemy. He gets to the water and then is killed bringing it back, quite simply. Later on, Ibn Shahra Shub gives more details about his death, that his hands were cut off, for example, or that the water skin was pierced. But those graphic details that are now recited in the Maqatil are not found in the very earliest transmissions. They come from perhaps earliest, 4th, 10th century. Qadi Uthman says that the enemy cut off his hands because they were angry with him, suggesting that after they'd killed Al-Abbas, they cut off his hands as an act of revenge. He doesn't suggest that his hands were cut off as he tried to carry water. Ibn Shahrar Shub does suggest that. And of course, fifthly, there is a final possibility, and you'll find it in the more contemporary Maqatil Abdurazaq, for example, that Al-Abbas went more than once for water. And I think this is a credible theory, that the attempt on the 9th of Muharram, if that was the day that he went with a whole group accompanying him, doesn't belie the fact that he might have also attempted the next day to get water, because water would have been an absolute necessity, if not for the soldiers themselves, even if it was just Hussein and Al-Abbas left, then certainly for the women and the children, about whom Al-Hussein took a great deal of care right until the end. So I finish by saying that I think that Al-Abbas is, for our contemporary world, an antidote for the utter selfishness with which people live, the complete self-absorption with which people live out their daily lives, the complete ignorance or lack of concern for anyone else around them. That seems to dominate the world which we have fashioned for ourselves. And then you have Al-Abbas, who, for the sake of even a group of crying children, is willing to die just to get water to them. It is an extraordinary and heroic act on his part. And so the reason I'm writing a book about him is not to explain his life to Shia Muslims, they know his life better than I do, but to present him to a non-Muslim readership as a perfect icon and archetype of not just bravery, but of selflessness, and maybe an antidote for our modern world, even for non-believers and for non-religious people, of a man who is willing to give his life for the needs of others, a man who is willing to forego his own rights, such as the right to life, so that others' rights may be respected. I look forward to talking to you again sometime, and I thank you for this honor of allowing me to share some of my thoughts about Al-Abbas with you. Every blessing to you all.
Thank you so much, Father Keristofer. It was a very touching, and also the mix of touching and scholarly discussion and reflections. Thank you so much. Like one question that I asked that just came to my mind. Did you your book, are you like talking about the parallelism between the Abbas and his uncle Ja'far ibn Abu Talib?
It certainly comes up. It comes up in a hadith, I think, from Zayn al-Abidin, that he too, Al-Abbas, because well, it's very interesting. He's given wings in paradise, like his uncle. So the question is, well, why is he given wings in paradise? And the answer is, well, perhaps because his hands have been cut off, which means that the cutting off of the hands is a much earlier tradition, if it comes from Zayn al-Abidin, which disappears from the texts and then reappears again 4th, 10th century, really, or 4th, 10th century in the Ismaili scholar, Al-Qadi, and then is taken up by later scholars. So this is a very interesting point, that if Zayn al-Abidin's hadith, as we find it, I think in Amali, I think Jafar Sadiq transmits it as well. If it's a credible hadith, then the tradition is much earlier, and for some reason it got lost and then rediscovered again.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, I just look at it on the Khasal, maybe on Amal Khasali of Saduq too. One other thing that was very interesting is that there's a similar, like a metaphor of like Safa and Marwa in Mecca, and also distance of, some people do like through Google Earth, Google Map, to calculation the distance between the two of this tomb is equivalent. Like there is, I don't know, like 380 meters, the same distance that happened to be in the between Safa and Marwa. So metaphoric. That was the interesting. That was like Hagar was like rushed to run between the two.
Running between the two for water.
This that situation.
I mean,
Zaynab that has like that.
In fact, in the works of Jafar as-Sadiq, not just Khisal, but also in his Amali, there are lots of traditions about the rewards of heaven for those who give water to the thirsty. So it's a very important theme. Aside from Abbas himself, it's an important theme that runs through Islamic piety and spirituality, and there are plenty of hadith in both traditions about the charity of giving water as the most important charity of all. And then you have Abbas, if you like, Abbas as the model living this hadith out. So it really is an interesting topic. And it's a topic that's very strong in Judaism and Christianity as well, giving water to the thirsty.
Yeah, very great. Yeah, one of the things also like in Shi'i culture, or at least like in the Persian-speaking Shi'i culture, is about attributed to Abbas. Like the key word is like adab, to having like the respect to the brother and to the imam, and even like it is also, I mean, some observation that the way that the tombs are placed like toward, because the two menorahs are kind of the way standing usually toward the Kaaba, the Qibla. And the way they're standing at this situation, Abbas is kind of behind, like behind to Imam Hussein, like it's like a prayer. Imam Hussein is leading and he's kind of back, like the tombs. So that is also the.
It's a point that I try to bring out in the book, that Al-Abbas seems to hide behind Hussein. He doesn't want to draw any attention to himself. He's there entirely for Al-Hussein and gives himself entirely for the defense of his imama, but he's wordless. Al-Abbas hardly ever speaks. He's always there hiding, and yet when he has to speak, he does, and he constantly points attention to the imam rather than to his own. But his own courage surely could be said to have equaled the courage of Al-Hussein on the day of Karbala from a purely human point of view. But he doesn't allow us to. He doesn't allow us to focus on him too much.
Great. Also, there is, I guess it's very recent. I don't know how old is that. There are like the rajas, like a poetry rajas, like the battle, kind of heroic like verses that like poetry verses he has attributed to him. But did you date these? Like how old are they?
No. I have to admit I'm a bit of a coward when it comes to poetry, because for me Arabic poetry is very difficult to translate into English. And I had this problem when I was doing the book on Karbala and the book on Lady Zaynab, that some of the most beautiful of the poetry, of course, is in Urdu. But the moment you translate, and I could easily get it translated, but the moment you translate, you lose the beauty and the majesty. And it's the same with the Arabic laments, especially the lament poetry, that the moment you try to put it into any other language for the benefit of your reader, it loses, as maybe even as does the Quran itself. The moment you translate it, it begins to lose its profound beauty. This is the problem of translation. So I've certainly included some of the laments and the poems recited about Al-Abbas. And there's some modern ones too, there's some contemporary ones, but I haven't included too many because there's quite a lot of other things I'm trying to squeeze in to say about him.
Yep. So the poetry I was talking about is attributed that Abbas was reciting when he went to the battle, but I guess it's a recent kind of thing. It's a more...
No, it's not recent, because almost even in Tabari, one of the earliest sources we have, lots of the fighters went into battle reciting poetry. So all three of Al-Abbas's brothers went in reciting poetry, and we know what they're reciting. We have it in the text. Yep. But you see, we don't have an example of Al-Abbas going into battle in that way. He dies doing something else. So there is poetry in which Al-Abbas, for example, proclaims that you will find him eventually lying under a pile of bodies and swords, and that he is there to defend with his own life, to defend the imam. You have a poem in which he recites about the sword that he's using, this sort of Indian steel that he's using. So there are a number of poems we have, but many of them, as you say, are recent. They're not found in the original sources.
Yeah, thank you so much, Father Kiristofer. It was our pleasure to host you, and we're looking forward for our future events.
Thank you, and I hope the book will be out fairly soon.
Yeah, we are looking forward for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Every blessing.
Yeah, God bless you.